Hey, I'm Joe Markman with Hard Energy. The Democratic National Convention takes place next week, and the Republicans will hold their convention the following week. It seems like a pretty good time to talk some politics and identify some of the issues that oil and gas folks should keep an eye on. Len Vermillion, Hart Energy's editorial director, is with me. And joining us are two shareholders in the Babst Calland law firm in Pennsylvania. Both of our guests specialize in advising oil and gas clients on a wide range of environmental issues. Welcome, Kevin Garber and Jean Mosites.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
I want to start with a pretty general question. In this election year, what do you see as the number one environmental issue of concern for oil and gas executives?
That's really tough to predict, Joe, of course, because it's going to vary depending on the size of the company and the location of its activities. But one thing for sure that we think have got to be high on the list is predictability and fair treatment. In other words, that fossil fuel companies are not to be disadvantaged vis-a-vis other alternative energy sources. And where that comes from is a tremendous uncertainty now in some of the areas of environmental law and certainly in the market. But if you take environmental law first, we have, of course, the deregulatory agenda under the Trump administration, many of which of those proposals have been challenged. Some have been stayed, some have been reversed, and some are still in litigation. We have a number of policy initiatives by both sides of the aisle in Congress that have different legislative and policy and regulatory implications. We have, of course, varying state programs, and when states implement their own programs, as we have in Pennsylvania, that I'm sure Jean will talk about shortly, we have our own cap and trade regulatory proposal under development. So there are a whole number of issues in the environmental context, and then when you overlay on top of that the uncertainties, tremendous uncertainties in the marketplace. Everything from low gas prices to oversupply, to in some cases, stressed balance sheets. You throw the COVID-19 slowdown of the entire economy on top of that. It really complicates things. And just as one quick example is that the January 20 Energy Information Agency outlook that was issued back in January, of course, before COVID, suggested that renewables are going to be the fastest growing electric provider in the next decade or more, and currently will tie and surpass electricity generated by natural gas, perhaps as quickly as 2040. So that's only 20 years from now. So tremendous market forces at play here. Jean, what would you add to that?
Climate change? I'll just give you a shorter answer, that climate change has got to be at the top of the list for environmental concerns for energy companies in particular, and for other companies as well. That everybody's looking at their practices, looking at the pressures, looking at the policies, looking at what they can do voluntarily. So that's a really big one.
How do you think that'll play with companies having to do ESG reporting now or anything like that? Is that going to become a bigger issue then, considering that with climate change?
I think it has been a big issue for several years. With this administration, there was a lot of concern that environment and climate issues were going to be tossed aside. So we've seen a lot of aggressive action at the state level, and a lot of cooperative action from the companies themselves. So yeah, it's really been playing strong. A lot of it slowed down with the pandemic and with with people just kind of reprioritizing where their resources need to be spent. But I don't see that as going away. And it's certainly, and actually the two kind of merge in some discussions about how the restructuring based upon the pandemic can also consider climate change.
Right.
So those conversations come together.
Well, I mean, I would guess, and maybe I'm just assuming here, and you don't want to do that, but if the Democrats take the office, it'll become a bigger issue, I would think, going into 2021. Is that, or am I just kind of assuming something there? Yeah.
Well, there will be a different power structure right at the federal level, and I think Kevin's prepared to talk about some of those issues.
Yeah, no question, Joe. The emphasis in the Biden plan that was released picks up a number of the legislative initiatives, primarily by the Democratic side of the aisle in the 116th Congress. And it'll be a stark contrast between what the current administration is doing on climate change and environmental issues generally as they relate to the oil and gas industry. So I think it is a night and day difference between the two approaches.
Do you the Biden approach swinging harder to the left?
On the federal level, and it has, of course, the implications that trickle down to the states, and Gene will pick that up. But let me start with the federal administration. As you know, in 2017, Trump issued the 2-for-1 deregulatory rollback order, as it's sometimes called, that was eventually upheld after litigation. And as a result of that, about 100 or so programs have been targeted for rollbacks. 69 of them have been taken so far. Another 40 or so are scheduled for the rest of this year. And if Trump is reelected, there are another group that are scheduled for his second term. But among that group are ones that are very helpful to the industries. The Waters of the U.S. rule, of course, is helpful to the upstream and the midstream section of the industry. The methane rule, very helpful to the midstream section, although a California federal court enjoined that rule on July 15th. You have the National Environmental Policy Act rollbacks. So you have a number of initiatives from a regulatory perspective in the Trump administration. And the Republicans in Congress, their legislative initiatives have generally been in the areas of research and development and tax credits to support clean coal, as an example. So you contrast that with the Biden plan. The Biden plan would spend $2 trillion, as has been widely publicized. And I'm just trying to a couple of notes here. $2 trillion over the next immediate future to implement the clean energy plan. And the Biden plan has two components, an administrative component and a legislative component. The administrative component, among other things, would reinstate the Trump rollbacks that I just mentioned, the Clean Power Plan, the Waters of the U.S., the methane rule. It would use the federal procurement powers to buy up to 3 million electric vehicles for clean energy and install 500,000 or so charging stations, a number of administrative and executive issues that the Biden administration proposes. And then legislation would have far-reaching bills that would build on some of the ones that are currently pending in Congress now, including zero. The big one that Gene mentioned is zero net carbon emissions, of course, in 2050. And some of the bills have different dates on them. There are bills that would go to 100% clean energy by 2035 and zero emissions by 2050. But it's clear that the Biden plan is heavily influenced by a number of the bills on the Democratic side that are currently pending in the 116th Congress that come from Senators Warren, for example, Bernie Sanders, there was something Ocasio-Cortez announced. It would restrict funding to the Army Corps of Engineers to issue permits for pipelines. So there are a number of those proposals that have been pending in Congress that the Biden plan incorporates and draws on. Last point, it doesn't go as far as to ban fracking altogether, as some proponents would have done, but it certainly would limit what federal permitting would be done for oil and gas extraction on federal lands. So big picture, some very significant differences between the current administration and if it were to continue into a second term versus the Biden administration if it is elected in November.
So how would that translate down to the state level then, especially you guys are in Pennsylvania? That's obviously a huge fracking area. I mean, I'm a Pennsylvanian too, so So, I mean, do you see that we'll have the same kind of thing going on with state legislation? And it's a little different. States are different from state to state, but you know.
Well, when you talk about environmental law and climate change, the states have always had a large role because they take primacy really to implement the federal statutes as well as the state statutes. So the action at the state level has been, I would say it's inconsistent based upon kind of resources and interest levels. In Pennsylvania, though, Governor Wolf has had an agenda to address greenhouse gas, to address methane emissions, to propose the new cap and trade to join the regional greenhouse gas initiative. And all of those have been going steady and strong in Pennsylvania despite the pandemic. So there really is no slowdown here on those types of things. And the other things that are continuing, if you look at kind of what were states doing before and after the pandemic, it did have an effect. And some of them had executive orders or created task forces or, adopted legislation a year or two ago, and then it slowed down this year because of, the effect of the shutdowns. But there are still a lot of initiatives, and a lot of them are multi-state initiatives. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative obviously is a 10-state program that reduces caps emissions from power plants. There's also a transportation climate initiative in the Northeast that's kind of taking hold. There are also memorandum of understanding among states for vehicle emissions and how they could coordinate among themselves. I think there are 15 states that have signed on to advance electric vehicle charging and promote the alternatives. So there are a lot of initiatives at the state level that are pretty important because they will affect kind of on the ground the industries and the activities in the states, and then those regional initiatives as well. And some of that, when I talked about these states running out of money, some of it is funded by the Volkswagen settlement money. You can see that that's something that has allowed them to continue to keep on this type of initiative.
So obviously we're seeing a lot of action in the courts right now, especially with the pipeline, the two big rulings, so forth. Do we see environmental issues, or do you see environmental issues becoming more of a court advocacy in the courts, or just things happening in the courts more than on the ground at this point? What role will the courts play? I guess I'm going in a roundabout way there.
Yeah, well, obviously that's a pretty important avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen, the litigation is pretty interesting. It's not only directly against energy companies, and some of those are based on consumer protection law, for example, saying that, we don't have enough information about what you're doing about climate change. So those cases are still going pretty strong around the country, and they're initiated by cities or by states. And we don't have big decisions. We had one decision, the New York decision against Exxon where New York lost that case because it couldn't be shown that there was really any misleading of investors. But those cases, the battleground right now has been procedural about whether or not they'll stay in state court or whether or not the energy companies can put them in federal court where they'd rather be. But it looks like most of them are going to be in state court. So we'll continue to watch those. And then obviously the big case, the climate change case, is the Juliana case versus the United States that's out in the Ninth Circuit. And that one is against about 20 federal agencies. And it's really asking the federal government to take responsibility for its role in permitting activities that allow emissions that contribute to climate change that affect the plaintiffs. So it's a bit attenuated, right? But that's the claim. And right now the status is that it was thrown out of court. It was dismissed for standing, and they've asked for rehearing. So that's one that we're going to closely watch to see, because it's a constitutional claim. It's not a statutory claim. It's saying that these plaintiffs have a constitutional right to a stable environment, and the federal agencies have an obligation to provide it.
To follow that a little bit, in early July, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline project was canceled, and the Dakota Access Pipeline was ordered shut down. So there are a lot of factors that led to this, but it happened during the Trump administration, which has been very pro-oil and gas. So we've been talking about the courts, but given the limits on this or any other president, I'm wondering, are we focusing too much on the presidential race? Are there so many factors affecting oil and gas areas?
I think you've said it very well, Joe. There are just an enormous number of factors that interrelate to one another, that involve all three branches of the federal government, the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive, of course, and then bring in states. As Gene outlined, states have their own programs. They're administering the federal programs, the Clean Water, the Clean Air Act, for example, but there is no overarching federal oil and gas program. So the states have their own programs, and Pennsylvania, of course, has its. And I think in the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, even though the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the right, I guess I'll call it, of the pipeline to go under the Appalachian Trail in June, then the plug was pulled in July, a month ago, for reported costs to rise that were supposed to rise from $5 to $8 billion. So a lot of that is certainly market forces. If you go back to the EIA projections, gas prices are not projected to rise significantly over the next decade or more. So that plays into the market force that are headwinds to the industry. And then the continued litigation that Gene mentioned, the opponents of fossil fuel generally and pipelines specifically are using a number of legal theories to block pipelines. The Dakota Access Pipeline is an example of that, as is the Mountain Valley Pipeline. That's the one that runs about 300 miles from West Virginia to Virginia, where the Corps of Engineers recently issued a certification for coverage to cross streams, but there are several cases pending in the Fourth Circuit on environmental impact statement grounds and the National Environmental Policy Act. So those are issues that the administration, whoever it is, are kind of beyond the reach of the administration, because now you're in the judiciary and you're dealing with implementation of statutes that have been enacted by Congress many, many years ago. NEPA was 1970. So I think back to your point, Joe, perhaps we are focusing too much on a single office, on being able to determine the course of things, but the office, nevertheless, is clearly important in setting the policy and directing the agencies. Jane, you would probably have something to add to that.
Well, I was going to say, of all the things that we've talked about, all the factors that are environmental, non-environmental, and federal and state level, but looking at the cities as well, looking at the really local level, there are task forces, there are climate plans, there are initiatives for electric vehicles and renewables and building codes, whether you can or cannot have gas hookups in new construction. So there are a lot of interesting things going on at a lot of levels, and it's certainly not just federal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Len, you may remember that here in Pennsylvania, we have 2,700, I think is the number, individual local units of government. And in Allegheny County alone, where Gene and I are, I think there are 130 municipalities in one county. So you can imagine the difficulty in getting local approval for a project that'll go across a municipal line. And some of these municipalities are just a few square miles. So it's a good point. Good point.
Right. Well, certainly environmental law is going to be, I guess, an exciting area to be in and going forward.
We think so.
Definitely.
Either of you have any final thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah,
one final thought is, so we are administrative law attorneys, right? So we're environmental attorneys, which is administrative law. And one of the things that the Trump administration has really encountered with trying to roll back regulations is that there's certain things you can't get around. You have to do things in a certain process, step by step by step. And so that kind of framework for what agencies do is still going to be something that any administration has to deal with. And we're always going to be looking for, if you want to change rules, whether you're this administration or another one, how do you do it? It takes a long time.
I guess back to one of the opening comments, there's this steady drumbeat of replacing fossil fuels with renewables, and doing it as quickly as we can. The Biden administration, the campaign, calls it an existential threat to the planet. So there is going to be tremendous policy pushing on that. And we'll just have to see how it plays out in the next 100 days between now and the election.
Okay. And Kevin, we won't hold that as a prediction.
Thanks, Len. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Kevin and Jean, for joining us. You've given us a lot to ponder as this election season heats up. And we're glad you could join us today.
Yeah, thank you both.
Yeah,
Happy to
thank
be
you very
here.
much. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
For more Hard Energy videos, follow our social media channels.